One of the most interesting questions in ecology is why are there so many species? And what I mean by that is how can there be so many species that live together? For example, in this grassland behind us, we have literally counted 64 different species right there. How can they be living together? In this environment, it experiences the same general climate, the same daily weather, there's the same soil and the same rock substrate. So how can there be so many species here? Or if we ask the opposite question, why is it that we don't have just one or two really efficient species, the most efficient species? So in a previous video, I talked about this topic and I used the example of 39 bromeliad species in the pineapple family that live together on a hilltop in central Panama, Cerro Jefe. The video, if you want to search for it, is called The Mystery of the 39 Bromeliads. And in that particular example, we have a slightly different situation because the environment is actually fairly old compared to what we have here. In central Panama, well, Panama itself has an age of around 3 million years. Due to plate tectonics and volcanic activity, the Isthmus of Panama rose up around about 3 million years ago. And this created what we call nowadays the Great American Biotic Interchange, or GABI, which is basically the movement of organisms from North America to South America and South America to North America using Panama as a land bridge. So basically in that example, we have a situation where we have species arriving and species evolving in place. There were endemic species there that are only found there, and basically the biodiversity can be explained by longer term processes operating in several million years that create the particular mix of species that are found there. Here it's a little bit different. You might be able to see behind me that basically we're in a glacial valley. This is a U-shaped valley where up until about 12,000 years ago there would have been a glacier. So the glacier would have come down from the north and then going towards Milan, the Po Plain, which is over in that direction towards the south. So until around 12,000 years ago, this place was under ice. The other thing that's very particular about this place is, as you can see, the land has been shaped and changed by humans. So we have these terraces which are basically a sign of agricultural activity, small-scale agricultural activity. And so there's a very definite human impact here. In fact, we call this a semi-natural grassland because there is a huge human impact, anthropogenic impact here. And I can't put an exact date on when these grasslands were first formed, but we do know, for example, that there were Roman remains found around here, and the main church down in the town was built in the 14th century. So a settlement, a substantial settlement for at least 600 years, a little bit more maybe. And we know that until about 200 years ago, there were roughly 150 people that lived in this general area. So when it comes to the age of this particular environment here, this specific grassland, we're talking something in the order of several hundred years. So there's a big difference here between a stable environment in the tropics where processes have had millions of years to build up and accumulate biodiversity, and a situation such as this where essentially on the geological timescale it's brand new and heavily influenced by human activity. So in the title I've made an analogy that the biodiversity that's been created here is like making a pizza. Okay, why the analogy? It sounds dumb, but I promise it's not. So to make a pizza, what I actually mean is it's a two-step process. You have long-term processes which are basically about getting the ingredients. So agricultural activity, the production of wheat and a clean source of water, yeast, salt, milk to make mozzarella cheese, and so the longer term agricultural activities create the list of ingredients. The next step, the second step in making the pizza, of course, is what happens in the kitchen or the pizzeria. and that's putting those ingredients together and cooking them to make the pizza. So the analogy with a grassland, the analogy in the natural world, is that there are longer term processes which create the ingredients list. And then there are short-term processes which put those ingredients together. In ecology, we would call this assembly, to make the final realized situation. The longer-term processes are to do with evolution by means of natural selection. And as Darwin pointed out, evolution, the change over generations, can bring about a situation of speciation, because different parts of a population can encounter different ecological conditions and take their own paths and become different species. It's something that in evolution we call diversifying selection. In modern evolutionary studies, there's a central concept which builds on natural selection, and it's also very pertinent to ecology, and it's called adaptive radiation. It means that that process of speciation is occurring through space and over time as different groups of individuals find different ecological situations. So the general effect is not just change and evolution with generations. It's not just natural selection. It's not just speciation, but occupying and adapting to a range of ecological situations which brings about a range of different taxa, a range of different species. Okay. So from our example from the tropics, from Panama, we can imagine that there, where it's relatively stable climatically, there are seasons, but the difference between the wet and the dry season isn't all that great. There's been no glaciation. There have been no major disturbances, and that biodiversity has accumulated by a process of adaptive radiation. Here, then, we're saying that the environment is much younger, okay, really a lot younger. So actually the species that are found here, we know that they evolved between around 3 and 12 million years ago. So they didn't do that here. None of the species here is endemic. None of them evolved in this place, okay. They came from other grasslands around about. Maybe there were natural grasslands up here on the mountain. There are rocky outcrops where there's no woodland, and maybe there were little patches of grassland up here on the mountain. And with humans creating this more extensive, suitable habitat, then they've come down and occupied and created really an extensive grassland. But what we have here is essentially a situation that lets us kind of ignore the evolutionary side of it for now. We know that evolution has had an effect here because there are different families of flowering plants, there are different species, so there is what we call a phylogenetic effect. But it allows us to concentrate on the shorter term processes, the kind of day-to-day, within the timescale of an individual lifetime, these kind of processes that we deal with in ecology. So here, in this particular grassland, we conducted a study several years ago now, but we conducted a study where we looked at the species that were here, the whole list of species, what we call the flora, and we looked at where those particular plants were. In practice, in this grassland behind me, we placed transects, so literally there were 5-meter long lines. And we did this 16 times, so 16 replicate transects. And at every single centimetre, we looked at the identity of the species that were there, and we worked out two things. We worked out, firstly, their functional type, which we'll talk about in a minute, but we also were able to calculate, actually put a number on how aggregated the particular species were. So where you have several points along that line, and it's all that species, you can say that they're clumped together, aggregated, or dispersed. And what we found was that in this grassland, basically, there are 4 or 5 species which are what we call dominants. They're the most frequent, the most abundant species. And in terms of how they work, in terms of their functional types, we characterize them in the context of Grimes' CSR triangle. I have other videos explaining CSR, but as a very quick overview, basically plants, when they get resources, they have a kind of dilemma with what to do with these resources. They can invest those resources in getting more resources, which means growing big quickly. And Philip Grime, the British ecologist, called this approach to life, this strategy, the competitor strategy, or we can also, in evolutionary speak, we can talk about C-selection. Okay, and if you plot this as a triangle, the C-selected plants are plotted up at the top corner. Plants can, however, survive by investing their resources in maintenance, in maintaining their tissues. They do this where it's not very productive, there aren't many resources, and there's a risk that metabolism is slow, growth is slow, and so they're really conserving and protecting those resources. And we call these plants stress tolerators. It doesn't really matter what the stress is. It could be a low temperature, it could be high temperature, it could be too much light, it could be toxic minerals in the soil. The general effect is to slow metabolism, slow growth, and slow productivity. Then particular plants are adapted to particular stresses in particular ways, but underlying that, there's a fundamental conservative way of growth, which we call stress tolerance. And the other corner of the triangle is something that we call ruderalism, or R-selection. And this is where the environment is potentially productive, there are plenty of resources, but every now and again the plants that have already grown, so this is after the process of growth, those plants get destroyed by something, such as being mown or grazed, or fire, something that destroys the tissues. So stress is about preventing the biomass from accumulating, from growing, whereas ruderalism is about the biomass being destroyed after it's made. And ruderals are adapted by completing their life cycle very, very quickly. So they're very small when they become adult, and when they flower, when they reproduce. So using this CSR system, we were able to characterize the plants in this grassland. And what we found was that there were several dominant species, several species that had a high abundance, and they were all down towards the S corner. They were all stress tolerators. So to be dominant in this grassland, you have to be a stress tolerator. But watch out. They all survive together, and to do this, they have a slightly different strategy. So there's a general convergence towards stress tolerator down in this S corner, but within that corner, the different dominant species are slightly different from one another. There's a divergence within this convergence, okay? So that's how the dominant species coexist. Now here it gets really interesting. There are several subordinate species that don't account for a lot of the cover, the ground cover here. And we found that basically the dominant species were forming clumps, so big clumps of plants, and the subordinate species were physically, spatially distributed between the clumps of the dominant species. So there's a kind of spatial reason for how they can survive alongside, how they can coexist alongside the dominant species. But there's lots and lots of subordinates, and if you look at the CSR triangle, they actually spread out to fill most of the triangle. They don't go right into the R-selected corner, they don't go right into the C-selected corner, but they do spread out and fill most of the CSR triangle. So there's a lot of functional variability here. Now it is a generally stressful site. In the summer it gets very, very hot. It can get to about 40 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's enough that when you're sitting still, not doing anything, you're sweating. Okay, it gets that hot. The soil is only about 40 centimeters deep throughout, and it gets dry. It gets hot and dry in the summer, and it gets cold in the winter as well. So there are abiotic environmental factors which represent survival risks for the plants. Okay. In evolutionary speak, they're selection pressures. The main selection pressures are abiotic, climatic, and from the soil, edaphic. In fact, this particular type of environment, this habitat, is recognized as what we call a xeric sand calcareous grassland. So a dry, sandy soil, calcareous bedrock. We can see the calcareous rocks in the mountains around us, grassland. So xeric sand, calcareous grassland. And that reflects the fact that the soil is well drained, it's very, very thin, it doesn't really hold the water. And along with the heat that this place gets in summer, I mean, at the moment it's the start of March and I'm under the sun, and I'm sure that at night time it's going to get very cold here, but at the moment I'm almost sweating, okay? So it is a stressful place. So aside from the stress factors that are found in this environment, there is also some disturbance. This is a meadow, and meadows by definition are mown or cut. Pastures are grazed, meadows are mown. And that does mean that there is some removal of biomass, some disturbance, but it happens at a height of around 7 centimeters. We measured this. It doesn't go right down to soil surface. And in this particular place where things are maintained by hand, I mean literally with scythes, it's not done in a uniform way in space and in time. There'll be patches that are done in 1 year, patches that are done in another year. So some areas which have been mown, some areas which will be mown the next year. And this creates opportunity. So there is stress and there is some disturbance, but it's not a stressful environment and an environment with intense, frequent disturbance. So why is there a mixture of different survival strategies amongst the subordinate species? Well, here it's not just about spatial distribution within the grassland, it's also about time, temporal distribution. And what we can see from the triangle is that we have species that are towards the R-selected corner, and these are smaller, shorter species that tend to flower early in the season when the dominant grasses are very low. And as the season progresses, the grasses grow higher and higher and higher. The light at ground level becomes much less, and the subordinate species shift towards the more competitive corner. Now, in fact, I was interested in the orchids that are growing here. I wanted to understand how there can be 7 different species of orchids growing right here together. And the idea was that they have the same general way of surviving, but they have very different flowers, so they have different pollinators. I thought it was that simple. But what I actually found surprised me. What I found was that at the start of the season, from late March onwards, we have the low dominant species, the low grass, and the orchids that are flowering are very small. They're very small. Anacamptis morio and species of bee orchids such as Ophrys flavicans and Ophrys sphygordes. And as we go through the months, as the grass starts growing and there's more canopy height, this shifts towards other orchids, which surprised me, because when I looked at them, when I measured them, they were actually pretty big, and I really didn't think that they would be. But we go through species such as Neotinia ustulata and Serapias vomeracea, and towards the summer, so towards the end of June, the start of July, we get orchids that are actually really quite big, Anacamptis pyramidalis and Neotinia tridentata. So this allowed us to actually come back and answer the question, how can there be so many species? How can there be so many orchids living together and coexisting in this grassland? So there are actually several answers. Firstly, in order to be a dominant species here, you have to be a stress tolerator, but slightly different from the other stress tolerators. To be a subordinate species, you have to be able to be small enough to occupy the physical gaps between the clumps of dominant species, and you have to be able to regulate your life cycle through the season in a way that takes advantage of the different niches that appear during the season. So the reason why there are so many species here is because the dominant species are similar but not the same, and the subordinate species have a particular set of adaptations that allows them to come in and take advantage of the little spaces that have been left and the little opportunities that the dominant species haven't got to. So coming back to the analogy with the pizza, here we have a huge ingredients list. We have 64 species, and the way that they're assembled to live together, the way that the pizza is baked, is more of an immediate process of ecological interactions. So one of the reasons for understanding this biodiversity, understanding how the plant community has formed, how the vegetation is maintained, is about conserving species for the future, but also about conserving traditional ways of life, understanding how to conserve this kind of environment. And I think essentially there's one main message that comes out of this. This environment, these grasslands, these species-rich arid grasslands are here because people have mown them and maintained them. Now at the moment there are several owners of this grassland, several owners of different parcels of grassland, and they're all old men. And they come out here and they mow because they've come to really love it. And one of them in fact told me that he cuts it, and he cuts it in a way which is in which he takes into account the flowering times of the orchids, because he wants to see them. So this environment is maintained and conserved by the action of a few individuals who are older and who, in line with much of society at the moment, have tried to better their sons and daughters who have gone to the city to work in a bank or whatever. And the younger generations then aren't used to this kind of work. They don't necessarily appreciate it, they don't want to do it, it's not what they see in their future. And essentially the main reason why we're going to lose these habitats is because the younger generations don't necessarily want to maintain them. They either don't understand them, don't appreciate them, or simply don't want the hard work that goes with maintaining this kind of environment. So climate change is going to be an important factor in the future, certainly. Things like nitrogen deposition from pollution, they're all important things, yes. But I think from what I've seen, my own personal observation of these kinds of environments, there is one main threat to biodiversity, and that is land use change. And this, I think, brings us to the real point of this video. Conserving species such as orchids, okay, it's not necessarily about the orchids, conserving environments, it's all about conserving traditional ways of life, it's all about conserving traditional approaches to agriculture in marginal environments, especially in the mountains, and that means shaping young minds, getting an appreciation of these aspects of the environment and biology, ecology. And I think that personally I'm uniquely placed working in an agriculture department at the university. I'm uniquely placed to talk to young people and try and get them enthusiastic about this kind of sociological aspect of conservation. And really the future is talking to young people. And I think that having the possibility of doing that through a medium such as videos, which can reach anyone, I think that's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to carry on with my scientific research. Maybe I'll write a book, who knows, but I think the best way of reaching people is this. So thank you for joining me. I'll be coming back here through the months as the season progresses, as the plants grow, as the orchids flower. Hopefully we'll see their pollinators as well, but I'll try my best to capture on video the most interesting aspects of this environment, and I hope that you come to appreciate it and to appreciate the link with traditional ways of life and agriculture. Thank you very much. So I just met Massimo, who's one of the owners of part of this land, and he explained to me that where we are now has basically been abandoned for the last 2 years, because the guy that owns it hasn't been out to cut for 2 years because he's very, very old, which is a big problem. Essentially what we can see here is a process of ecological succession where we get shrubs and then larger woody vegetation coming in. Here we have Rubus fruticosus, bramble, and then behind me there are seedlings of hornbeam, Carpinus betulus, which obviously is coming from the oak hornbeam forest which is surrounding this grassland. And essentially this shows the importance of management, the importance of mowing. Although it might sound counterintuitive that a human disturbance, an anthropogenic disturbance, can be beneficial for biodiversity, mowing is essentially preventing larger plants which need more time to establish. It's preventing them from getting a foothold and from taking over and monopolizing the area. So essentially in ecological succession, there's a natural development through the years as larger plants come in and the vegetation gets taller and taller and taller until eventually we have woodland. But essentially the management is resetting that, taking it back to an appropriate point for the smaller herbaceous plants and for the grassland. So it's absolutely essential. So another thing that Massimo explained to me was how he uses his land for small-scale agriculture. Essentially, it's not used for one particular thing. It's not just about olive production. He has planted some vines, so Chardonnay grapes for making wine, but he produces rhubarb and makes rhubarb jam. He gave me some rhubarb jam before. And also for just small-scale vegetable production. Up on some of the terraces, he's also prepared some land, which we'll see later, for maize production, so to produce maize flour, so to make something that we call polenta. And so essentially there's a patchiness also in how it's used agriculturally. It's not devoted to any one particular crop or any one particular system. We have grapevines, we have rhubarb production, all sorts of different ways of cultivating plants. So it's generally a very heterogeneous environment, a very patchy environment, both with regard to the semi-natural vegetation, but also with regard to the cultivation and the crops. And of course, we're interested in the diversity of the species that are living together within the grassland. But a part of that is also the fact that there are groups of plants, groups of different species around within these patches which can contribute with seeds. They contribute to what we call the species pool, the total the total number of species that can be found in an environment, which basically depends on seed dispersal. So the fact that there are small patches of native vegetation throughout the crops is actually very important even to the areas of extensive grassland, because they're a source of seeds, they're a source of different species, which then we do find in the grassland as well. So it's about patchiness within the general local landscape. One of the reasons why terraced cultivation like this is particularly encouraging for biodiversity, it's not just about resetting the ecological succession, but you can see that the slopes are havens, safe havens for native species. And this is a kind of spatial patchiness, a kind of heterogeneity, where those species can find a place to live. So it's cultivated, there's disturbance, there are patches of ground that are very, very heavily disturbed, but there are spaces where the native species can live. So just as another example of spatial patchiness, spatial heterogeneity, Massimo was explaining to me that this plot of land, this particular plot of land this year, will be used for maize production. You can see the main grassland back there in the background, but over to my right there is also a nice example of the grass under the olive trees which hasn't been cut, so the vegetation is slightly taller, and again we have some heterogeneity in this environment with the same general mix of species that I can see in the main grassland over there, but the plants are at a slightly different developmental stage. So Massimo was telling me a little bit about the history of this place, which is very pertinent to how it's managed today. And essentially that white house you can see, the idea was originally that all of the landowners would put their money together and buy it, and it would be a commune for recovering drug addicts. And the idea was, of course, to give drug addicts an occupation, something to do, something to involve them, and this would essentially help with the maintenance of the environment and the habitats that we see here. And I think for me it illustrates a very important point, that there has to be a reason for doing work on the land, and that's the way that we get to this point of having a high biodiversity grassland, because it's not just the natural processes that are happening here, it's not just the evolution, it's not just the immediate ecology, it's about the economic activity. So if there's one word that I think encapsulates the biggest influence that humans have on biodiversity, I think it's economy, the economy. The economy can be a positive thing. Economic activities can bring about a situation of high biodiversity like we see here. Or the economy can take a different turn and it can be essentially a negative force. It depends on what that economic activity is. So we've just seen a wide range of species that coexist together in a xeric or dry calcareous grassland. What processes resulted in this local within community, what we call alpha diversity? And what can we learn about coexistence in this particular plant community that we can apply to other plant communities? How can we understand biodiversity creation in general? Well, in the first part I gave you a basic overview of coexistence using the analogy of a pizza, making a pizza. And the idea is that to make a pizza, there are actually two stages. One is a longer term stage, which involves making the ingredients, so agriculture, which gets you the list of ingredients that you use to make the pizza. And the second phase are short-term processes, which are basically cooking. And the analogy with the plant community, so for a community, the longer-term processes are to do with evolution, which create the list of ingredients, let's say, or in other words, the list of species. And the shorter-term processes are essentially ecology, and these ecological processes that happen within the lifetime of individuals, which are equivalent to cooking the pizza. And the other part of this analogy with a pizza is that with a pizza, there are some ingredients for which you need a lot of them to make the pizza base. And then there are other ingredients where they basically make the topping, they make it more varied, they make it more interesting, but they're required in much smaller amounts. So with a community, the equivalent there is that there are some species which are dominant, which have a very high local relative abundance, and they form our pizza base, let's say. And there are species which are much less abundant, and these are essentially the subordinate species which make the community particularly varied. So we want to ask questions such as, why are some species relatively common and others relatively rare locally? Why do some form a good solid pizza base and others make the pizza topping? How can it be that that pizza topping is so varied and so interesting? So by looking at the 64 species found here in this xeric grassland, it's evident that only a few species are locally common and a huge number are locally rare, but they do consistently form part of the vegetation. I previously explained in part 3 that the species pool, or the number of species that can take part in local plant communities, is particularly high here, because the environment is maintained in a heterogeneous and patchy way. I also explained in part 1 that in this xeric sand calcareous grassland, we measured the relative abundances of the species, and this allows us to rank the species in order of abundance, running left to right. So this is a rank abundance curve. Note that the colours, red, green, blue, represent the CSR plant functional types. So on the left we have a small number of relatively abundant species that are extreme stress tolerators. To the right of these there are less abundant species that show a mix of different functional strategies. Now there's no magic number where we can say this is dominant, this is subordinate, but I should point out that on this rising upward leg on the left, there's one species in particular, Bromus erectus, which is considered to be a dominant species in this kind of plant community. It's actually not the most abundant species here, but it's in this group. So I'm going to consider all of these 5 species as dominant. Then we have 49 species which are subordinate. So they're consistently found here and they're very low relative abundance. And this brings the total in this graph up to 54 species. Now if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that I keep saying that we found 64 species here in this grassland. And I'm not lying, it's true, because there are 10 species which fall into another category, the transients. And these are species for which basically we've found them, we've observed them locally, but their abundance is so low and they're not consistently found. Maybe only 1 or 2 individuals, something like that. They're here, so it's also correct that we say that they're here, but they don't represent perhaps a stable part of the community. So we can identify with this rank abundance curve dominants, subordinates, and then there's this group of extra species, the transients. So although the transients aren't shown here, they are actually crucial to understanding the processes of community assembly and community change But for now we'll concentrate on the more obvious processes, sorting the species pool into dominant and subordinate members of the plant community. Essentially what we want to know is why some species are common and others are rare, and also how there can be so many locally rare species that are nonetheless consistently found. For the subordinate species, a much wider range of functioning is evident. Are these subordinate species present because they're potentially dominant but have in some way lost out to the current dominance? Or are they present because they're specialized and adapted to be subordinate? The answer is both. A small number are potential dominants, but most are not. They're adapted to be subordinate. How do I know this? Because a small number of species found here are also known to be dominant in other environments. For example, here the false oatgrass, Arenatherum elatius, has a very low relative abundance, but it can be the dominant grass in lowland meadows on nutrient-rich soils. Dactylis glomerata is another subordinate species here, but it can be a co-dominant with the false oatgrass in those lowland meadows. In contrast, there are species which are evidently specialized to be subordinate. So the most extreme example, I think, from the plants that we've seen at the start of this video are the parasitic plants. For example, the Orobanche alba is an obligate parasite of species in the Lamiaceae family, in the family in which we have thyme. And so the Orobanche is parasitic on the thyme, and of course a parasite can't have a higher relative abundance than its host. And if we look at this in terms of biology, we can see Orobanche as a parasite, but if we look at it through the eyes of ecology, essentially the thyme is facilitating or making easier the life of the Orobanche. So the Orobanche is adapted to be subordinate, and even the thyme itself is a subordinate species. There are other examples. For example, we saw Primula veris at the start of the season, and a very low abundance. It is consistently found in the grassland, but essentially Primula veris can survive in the grassland because it flowers early on before the grasses get tall, and so it's taking advantage of that, what we call a vernal or spring temporal niche, and kind of completing its life cycle early on. So it's clear that it's not a dominant species. It's very definitely a subordinate based on its life cycle. The orchids also provide a perfect example of species that are adapted to be subordinate. None of the species here are known to be dominant species in other environments. That's why you've heard of a grassland but not an orchid land. Many of them use deceptive pollination mechanisms that trick insects into pollinating them without providing nectar. Okay, and for this to work, it requires a larger number of nectar-rewarding flowers that can feed and support the insects. These mechanisms would not work if the orchids were relatively abundant. So paradoxically, they must be rare locally for their reproductive adaptations to work. So they're adapted to be subordinate. The point is that all of these are examples of facilitation, with the dominant species acting as so-called ecosystem engineers, creating habitat for other species which are adapted to be subordinates. The existence of these species, the Primula veris, the orchids, the parasitic plants, for example, and I also showed in another video the epiphytic bromeliads growing on trees in central Panama. These examples all show that much of local species richness depends on the dominant species creating opportunities, creating niches for other species. So we saw in the last video that here a patchy and heterogeneous environment generates a particularly large species pool, or all of the species that can potentially participate in the community. These species are then filtered by environmental selection pressures, primarily involving the degree of competition, limiting stress factors and lethal disturbance events. As the dominant species are extreme stress tolerators, it's clear that stress tolerance is particularly important for fitness in this environment. But the subordinates show a range of CSR strategies.
Evidently, high abundance is associated with high specialization towards stress tolerance. But low abundance can occur for a range of different strategies. Here, the facilitation comes into play. Like the tropical trees creating opportunities for the epiphytic bromeliads, the subordinates are facilitated by the dominants. We saw in part 1 that the subordinates physically occupy the gaps and spaces between clumps of dominant species. The subordinates occupy microsites that are not exploited by the dominants. They occupy a smaller scale of microhabitat. Whereas the dominants cover tens of centimeters in this particular grassland example, the subordinates occur at the scale of just a few centimeters. The mix of subordinate CSR strategies which are consistently found demonstrates that there are a greater number of heterogeneous opportunities, a kind of micro-scale patchiness. So while the ecological filtering is a strong process for the dominant species, the dominants then ameliorate filtering for the subordinates, giving them access to the community. Differences over time are also important. In previous years, we've seen a shift during the season from relatively ruderal orchid species evident when the grasses are short to larger species towards the summer when the grasses are tall. So these relationships between dominants and subordinates shift away from facilitation towards competition as the season progresses. So the importance of competition changes through the season. Coexistence of the subordinate species depends on the timing, microsite characteristics, and species traits. So with regard to timing, this can involve reproductive timing, obviously with early flowering. We saw the example of the primula and the earlier flowering orchids. But a part of the differences between species are, well, it can be to do with the growth form, for example, low-lying species with rosettes, or spreading species with lateral stems, such as the Thymus longicaudis. There are also pollination niches, different adaptations for pollination. Wind pollination in the case of Rumex achitosa. Pollination by long-tongued bees in the case of Anthillis vulneraria or Trifolium pratense. Short-tongued bees in the case of Bellis perennis. Specific bee species in the case of Ophrys sphygores being pollinated by Andrena bees. Butterflies are important pollinators, specifically in the case of Clinopodium vulgare. Hoverflies can be important in the case of Achillea millefolium. And general insect pollination, including the beetles, for example, in the case of Centaurea nigrescens. Some of these species we've not seen yet because they flower slightly later in the year. Okay. Another important difference between species which can help coexistence is the regeneration niche. So when the seeds germinate, how they establish as young plants. Seeds germinating early in the growth season after the winter on dry micropatches of soil that are wetted early in the spring, for example, Plantago lanceolata, or seedling establishment in shallow, dry soil using rapid root growth and relatively deep tap roots. Here the best example is perhaps Salvia pratensis. Coming back to our original question, why are some species common and others rare? It's evident that some species are common because they're particularly well adapted to the general site conditions, and most are rare because they're not able to be dominant. They rely on opportunities provided by other species, perhaps resources that are found at a smaller scale than that occupied by the dominants, or because the dominants buffer the microclimate against environmental extremes, such as excessive light and heat, or where the gaps between dominants allow seedlings to establish. And these differences in physical scale are important. One question that I've left hanging until now is, why are there so many subordinate species? I also said that the transient species, those represented by just one or two individuals that don't establish stable populations, will help us to understand this process. What I mean is this: the presence of transient species is a clear demonstration of a degree of randomness and stochasticity during community assembly. Some things just happen to arrive on the wind, seeds for example, some species arrive as seeds on the wind, and this randomness can also explain why there are so many subordinate species. Year after year, decade after decade, and century after century, species travel through the environment as seeds, and there is a continuous semi-random flux of species. I say semi-random because it's constrained by the type and abundance of species in the area. The transients can arrive from surrounding vegetation and essentially be the raw material of succession and community change. So not necessarily important for the current community, but perhaps the seeds of future vegetation development if management activities should change. But here's where it gets really interesting for ecologists. We've talked about specific phenomena and processes, species pools, ecological filtering, plant functional types, in a search for rules governing the assembly of plant communities, rules that lead to predictability. Perhaps, however, the rules only apply up until a certain point, because stochasticity inevitably introduces a degree of uncertainty regarding the species that can actually enter the community. Much like the daily weather, this is something that's very difficult to predict. So in the last video about the forces that create local or alpha diversity, the kind of species richness that we find within plant communities, I ended up by talking about randomness and stochasticity and the fact that the local community is actually linked with other communities in this surrounding environment, what we call the gamma diversity. And this is basically by seeds being dispersed on the wind and something called seed rain, where the seeds fall into the community. And so stochasticity, randomness, is a part of community assembly. And my idea was to come here today when there was a storm. In fact, I was actually looking for bad weather when I came, and this morning it was really, really bad weather, with the idea of catching a kind of storm event, a really windy moment when the seeds are likely to be dispersed. And the other thing is that, as you've just seen, a lot of plants are now starting to produce fruits and seeds. So we're really getting into the period when we can start to see seed dispersal. But unfortunately I missed the lightning, I missed the thunderstorm, which is probably just as well because many botanists die from lightning strikes or coconuts to the head. And I've decided to talk about something else that I brought up last time, and I want to carry on with the topic of ecological filtering, because that depends a lot on individual genotypes, genetic diversity, because communities are groups of populations, and populations are groups of individuals. And individuals, especially if they come from sexual reproduction, which in fact we're seeing in most of the species that we have here, populations are made up of genetically distinct individuals which have their own characteristics, the kind of outward expression of the genotype, which we call the phenotype. So when species are filtered to create the plant community, it's actually the individuals that are being filtered. The individuals are being selected. Some individuals are fit for the local environment and others are not, and they die. This selection is especially active for seedlings, for young plants, and it's usually only a very few individuals that get through to adulthood to reproduce. So essentially, what I'm going to show you now is that within one species, there are individual genotypes which we see as different phenotypes, we see as different forms. And although this is a concept that we can apply to any sexually reproducing species, it's particularly evident to the naked eye for some species. So what I'm going to talk about now is valid for all of the sexually reproducing species here, but I'm going to take one particular species, which is Neotinia tridentata, so this orchid that we've seen a lot of at this grassland. Now, there are some characters of organisms which are kind of fixed and they define the species. And there are other characters which are variable from individual to individual, and Neotinia tridentata shows this really, really well. So, Neotinia tridentata, it means three-toothed, because the labellum, the landing platform for the pollinators, because this has three main lobes. But one of the features that really stands out about this orchid is that three of the tepals, the petal-like structures at the top of the flower, form a kind of hood for the pollinating insect, and they end in a kind of canine tooth. So when you look at the orchid, each flower kind of has like three little teeth that stick up. And then there are characteristics which change from individual to individual, and so I'm going to show you some photographs now of the plants from here, the individual plants from here. And don't forget that these photographs are of individuals that are growing within a few meters of each other, so even though they look very, very different, they are from one local population. They're not from northern Italy, southern Germany or something like that. And what you can see is that the form and the size and the coloration of this labellum is strikingly different between individuals. Now, for the orchid, there's actually a good reason for this, because it's one of these orchids that doesn't provide a nectar reward, so it uses what we call a food deception pollination mechanism. So the insects see a flower which has the right colours, it's the right size for the insect, and they come along, but then they don't find a nectar reward, so they pass on to another flower. Now, if that other flower is exactly the same, insects are not stupid. They'll recognize that it's exactly the same. They can understand that there's no nectar reward, and they wouldn't go to it. So if that flower is slightly different, it still has the correct cues for being a flower that they can get nectar from. It still has the right colors, more or less the right shape, but it's slightly different, then they will accept it as a place where they can search for nectar. So in order to guarantee pollination, the flowers of Neotinia tridentata have to be slightly different from one another, and that represents individual genotypes being expressed as the phenotypes. Okay, fine. So we have a population in which the individuals are expressing a range of different phenotypes. That's very pretty, lots of nice pretty flowers, but why is that important? What does it tell us about the plant community? What does it tell us about the ecosystem? So thanks to British ecologist Philip Grime, we know that having a range of individual genotypes in a population increases the stability of the plant community. And what I mean by stability is that within that plant community, it's less likely that a particular species will go extinct locally. So a stable community is one that retains its species, and an unstable community is one that loses species. And when you lose species, you lose capabilities, you lose possibilities. Maybe there's a particular flower on which a particular pollinating insect is dependent for food, and then you lose the insect, and then you lose the birds because they have no insects to eat, and okay, so a stable community is one that retains its plant species and all of the other species that depend on them. So what Grime did was to create what we call microcosms, so recreating plant communities using individual plants. And he did this in two ways. In a comparative way, some of these microcosms were made with essentially clones. So for each particular species, the individuals were divided vegetatively, creating genetically identical individuals. And then other microcosms were created using plants that had been collected at different points in the wild, so they were genetically different from one another. And what they found was, essentially, the communities that were made from sexually reproduced individuals, genetically distinct individuals, tended to retain these species over time. So some individuals would die out, but there would always be some individual representing the species. In comparison, the microcosms that were made from genetically identical individuals tended to lose species and so become less stable. So there's a very important lesson here. The genetic variability of populations, the range of individual genotypes, is important to plant communities and then also to ecosystems because it confers stability, and stability means that these ecosystems are resilient to changes. We've been looking at the forces that create a species-rich plant community, and we've looked in some detail at one particular site, looking at the species that emerge as the growth season progresses. So we have an idea of how biodiversity has come about in this community, but of course we're also searching for general phenomena creating biodiversity in other environments, so it's time to take a look at other plant communities and compare them. Essentially, the main question we'll be answering is, why do some communities have more species than others? We've already seen that heterogeneous environments, and in particular sites that are managed in a heterogeneous way, have a larger species pool. But this is only part of the story. To really understand, we need to consider something called productivity. Productivity is an interesting phenomenon because, on the one hand, it essentially represents the amount of plant growth within the overall vegetation, but as plants grow and become large, they can affect the smaller plants, and so changes in productivity also change the types of plants that can survive, and so the character of the plant community. Technically, productivity is a measure of how much biological material, or biomass, accumulates over a defined period of time. And it's a symptom of how the vegetation works because greater productivity represents greater rates of processes such as photosynthesis in the individual plants. To measure productivity, we need to cut and destroy plots of vegetation at the start and at the end of the growth season and work out the difference in biomass. A less destructive and less time-consuming approach is to simply measure what we call the standing biomass, or the amount of material that is simply standing in place. But we must be careful to do this at the end of the growth season, at the peak of growth. So what we call the peak biomass is correlated with productivity, Not in a simple way, not in a linear way, but we can measure peak biomass and use this to directly indicate productivity. So if we do this and relate productivity to the species richness in different herbaceous plant communities, what we get is this. Firstly, the different coloured points represent different types of meadow or pasture grasslands, and the codes stand for classes recognised by European Union law, specifically the so-called Habitats Directive. The grey points are other herbaceous habitats that are not meadows or pastures. These are all real data points that we measured in northern Italy, but the habitat classes are important habitats recognised throughout Europe. So one of the first things to jump out at us is that meadows and pastures are the most species rich and are all characterised by moderately low productivity, whereas communities at extremes of productivity, both extremely low and extremely high, do not have many species. So what's going on here? Well, we've already seen that a species-rich grassland can be characterised by a few dominant species with similar approaches to survival or strategies, but also a much larger range of subordinate species that show a wider range of strategies and functioning. In fact, when we plot a similar graph, but instead of species richness, or the number of species, we plot strategy richness, or the number of strategy classes in each plant community, we can see that there's also a peak in strategy richness that matches the peak in species richness. So more species because there are more strategies, more ways of surviving. Now, I've not shown it here, but this is also linked to greater variability in specific traits, such as whether the species have soft or tough leaves and so are inherently fast or slow growing, if they tend to spread out, or even the date when they start flowering. So we have variability in the number of strategies, but what about the type and character of these strategies? How do these change along the productivity gradient? And why are only a few species found at extremely low and at extremely high productivity? Well, what happens is very interesting, but I have to put together various pieces of information to explain it properly. First, we can plot each plant community according to the average CSR strategy of the plants that make it up. So in the CSR triangle we've been hearing so much about. This tells us about the general approach to survival that's evident for each community. Then the colour indicates the species richness, so yellower equals more species, dark means very few species. Then the size of the point for each community represents the amount of biomass, indicating the productivity. In this case, larger equals greater biomass and greater productivity. So essentially we can see that species poor communities are either dominated by plants that get large fast in productive situations, which I can tell you are river margins or roadside verges, or species poor communities are characterized by small, extremely fast-growing species in low productivity and highly disturbed situations. Interestingly, lowland meadows have moderate to very high species richness, intermediate productivity, and intermediate competitive ruderal ecological strategies. Calcareous grasslands have the highest species richness and have low to intermediate productivity and intermediate strategies, but this time the strategies are competitive stress tolerators with lower values of ruderalism. Grasslands found over siliceous rock or acid soil have extreme stress tolerator strategies and low to intermediate species richness and productivities. This makes a great deal of sense biologically because the way that plant roots take up nutrients is less effective in acid soils, and there are fewer species that are specialized to cope with this restriction to growth. So coming back to the main graph, the plant communities at the extremes of productivity have small numbers of species for different reasons. Highly productive vegetation occurs where the environment is stable and has plenty of resources, light, water, and soil nutrients, and very few limitations to growth or events that destroy the biomass that's already been produced. The fittest plants in this situation grow large rapidly, and few species can survive underneath them. At low productivities, plant communities are either composed of species adapted to extreme levels of disturbance factors that destroy biomass after it's been produced, or to stress factors that limit growth and biomass production. High species richness is not possible at these extremes, but richness can emerge at low to moderate levels of productivity because it's not absolutely necessary to be highly specialized ecologically in order to survive. Why is this not a simple relationship where all communities at moderate productivity are rich? Why are only some communities at moderate productivity full of species? This is where the species pool comes in. In heterogeneous or patchy environments with a wider range of habitats, a larger number of species are generally found throughout the landscape and can contribute to the richness of each single habitat. Where the environment is more homogeneous and there are fewer species in general, the local richness of each community is restricted. Although the relationship between productivity and species richness is not simple, we can't just take a measurement of biomass and know the species richness. What we can know is where high richness is not possible and the character of the plant communities that are found along this gradient. This kind of information is fundamental to understanding how environmental changes alter productivity and will restrict or encourage richness. This affects how we can effectively conserve local biodiversity or where we must pay particular attention to the character of that biodiversity. To understand how plants function and survive, we have to keep in mind what happens inside cells, particularly during photosynthesis. If you've never been taught cell biology or the intricacies of photosynthesis, don't worry. Essentially, we have to understand just one simple fact. Cells are made of molecules that must have particular shapes and arrangements in order to work effectively. Alternatively, a condition of stress is simply when the various structures and components and processes occurring within cells don't work as effectively as they could. This is either because the plants don't have enough resources in order to make these components, or because other factors, non-resource factors, disrupt the structures and processes. So effectively there are two main causes of stress: a lack of resources to produce molecules, or disruption of existing molecules. But stress is a condition that has a single simple definition: the suboptimal functioning of cells. Within plant cells, photosynthesis is particularly delicate because it's essentially about managing the energy levels of electrons and atoms in such a way that biological molecules can be produced. Understanding that photosynthesis is affected not just by resources but by non-resource factors is something that's crucial to understanding plant function and plant ecology, particularly when it comes to light. In ecology, light is often seen simply as a resource. Plants photosynthesize and need light. Getting light is crucial to survival. Plants compete with each other for light because it's a limiting resource. It sounds reasonable, but this is only half the picture, and actually not a very realistic one. Light, of course, is a form of energy that interacts with matter, with atoms and molecules, such as molecules of chlorophyll, essentially by donating its energy to the electrons that make up the bonds between atoms, exciting them. This excitation energy can be passed between molecules to energize electrons and eventually to make chemical bonds that link biological molecules together. That's an extremely simplified but fundamentally correct description of photosynthesis. The point is that when electrons absorb energy, it can be too much. And when electrons have too much energy, they don't occupy the space between atoms in a way that binds the atoms together. They're not strongly or appropriately associated with the atomic nuclei, resulting in the molecules falling apart. Even chlorophyll, when it absorbs energy from too many photons, can degrade. In fact, photosynthetic cells must constantly protect, repair, or replace chlorophyll. And if you've ever extracted chlorophyll in a school lab experiment, you'll have been told to keep it out of the light because it breaks down very quickly. Outside of the cell, it doesn't have the usual supporting structures and repair mechanisms that keep it working. And that light can be excessive and dangerous to photosynthesis is an extremely well understood phenomenon known as photoinhibition, or photodamage when it's extreme. It's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that more light equals more photosynthesis, equals more biomass and more productivity. But imagine thinking that more gas or petrol means that your automobile or car can simply do more, go further, and is better. So you just keep filling the gas tank, keep filling, and anyone that gets in your way must be fought off. In reality, you wouldn't keep pumping gas into your gas tank until it overflows, because there's a point at which it's no longer needed, and an excess actually becomes dangerous, certainly not worth fighting for. For plants on a sunny day, this point is typically around midday. They've been photosynthesizing all morning, the sugars have built up in the entire plant, and the photosynthetic cells eventually fill up with crystals of what we call primary starch. The gas tank is full. Any more light energy can't be used, but the chlorophyll keeps absorbing it, and it starts to become a dangerous problem, breaking down the chlorophyll. The energy must be shunted away from the chlorophyll, and plants have a few tricks to do this. Additional pigment molecules, such as red anthocyanins or yellow carotenoids, are used to either block light or to accept the energy and to help with eventually dissipating it into heat. But there's one basic physical phenomenon that chlorophyll uses to protect itself. It's a trick that all plants do, and it's something that demonstrates that for all plants, light can be a problem that must be managed, and that they're adapted to deal with light not just as a resource, but as a potentially damaging environmental factor. When chlorophyll accepts photons of light, it becomes excited, which in practice means that the electrons that form part of its structure change position. But if this excitation energy is not used, the electrons tend to fall back into their lower energy state, so they change position back to how they were. And the energy has to leave the system. In fact, it leaves as photons of light, a phenomenon that we know as fluorescence. In other words, when sunlight is excessive, particularly when plants are in a condition of stress and they really can't deal with that extra energy, plants will actually emit a subtle background glow as they fluoresce light back into the environment. This chlorophyll fluorescence, which we usually don't see because the sunlight is so much stronger, is lower energy light, and in practice this means that it's a red glow emitted from the leaves. Chlorophyll fluorescence demonstrates the universal ability of plants to deal with light as a damaging stress factor, rather than simply as a resource. As the fluorescence is a gentle background glow, I have to cut out the sunlight and induce the fluorescence with a less visible but nonetheless strong light source. I'm simply showing that the plants can do this, and I'm not worried about putting a number on how much fluorescence there is and how stressed precisely these plants are, but machines do exist that can quantify this. Okay, so this is a real capability of all plants that they use to manage a potential stress factor, too much light. So coming back to ecology, sometimes you may hear that species are present in their habitats because they are, and I quote, the superior competitor in that habitat. This assumes that the environment is simply a provider of resources and that plants interact with the environment and with each other by obtaining and modifying resources. And this is one of the basic premises of what we call competition theory in ecology. Competition for resources can be important, but plants don't grow where they do because they are the superior competitors, but because they're the most appropriately adapted. They are the fittest and they survive. And that doesn't always involve competition. The appropriate language to use in ecology is survival of the fittest, just as it is in the rest of biology. In fact, in the words of Darwin, two canine animals in a time of dearth may be truly said to struggle with each other, for which shall get food and live. But a plant on the edge of a desert is said to struggle for life against the drought. In other words, it's the individual that survives or not, and often other plants or other organisms are not involved in these life or death events. As another way of illustrating this, I'd just like to show you a few examples that I've seen in different environments around the world that can be interpreted in terms of individual plants surviving because they are adapted to tolerate harsh environmental conditions, but other plants are evidently not involved. Alternatively, it's really difficult to interpret the presence of these species in their habitats as being due to, in a sense, having won some kind of battle with another species. So coming back to the main point, if you see the environment only in terms of resources for growth and think that plants are mainly adapted to the availability of resources, which is the main premise of competition theory in ecology, then I'm sure that's fine for maybe interpreting hypothetical models of how plant communities should logically be. I'm not sure how you can use these ideas to understand how 64 species coexist together in a real grassland. Just to keep it real, let's consider the identities and adaptations of real species. Does the early spider orchid, Ophrys sphegodes, live here because it is the superior competitor? For what? For light or for nutrients? Is an epiphytic bromeliad growing on a tree in Panama a superior competitor? And is it competing against the tree? Or should we restrict what we consider to be the plant community to just the bromeliads or just the orchids, so that we can make that competition theory work for us and really understand that model? If, on the other hand, the thing that you want to understand is the natural world or plant communities, a different approach is probably of more actual use, centered on concepts more like plant biology, natural selection, physics, and things like that, which have more of a scientific basis and are supported by a vast amount of empirical evidence which really, seriously, should not be overlooked in ecology. We've been looking at the phenomena creating biodiversity using the analogy of a pizza in which some ingredients, those used to make the main part of the pizza base, are required in large amounts and take a long time to obtain, equivalent to the dominant species in the plant community, and some ingredients are needed in much smaller amounts but are varied and make the pizza interesting, equivalent to the scarcer or subordinate species in the plant community. But what happens when someone sprinkles chocolate on your pizza? In plant communities, some of the local biodiversity has arrived only recently in the form of alien or exotic species with their origins very often on different continents. Until now, we've been looking at this dry grassland community in terms of native species and native biodiversity. Species that have evolved nearby and are adapted to local conditions and ecology. But even here, alien plant and animal species have arrived and could potentially change the ecosystem. As the season progresses, these species have become more frequent here, and crucially, alien species are more evident in the patches of land that have not yet been mown or managed, or have been abandoned by their owners. So here there are actually two main themes to explore. Firstly, the succession or development of the vegetation, but also how management is key to invasion as a process and keeping invasive species in check. So firstly, in the main grassland, alien species are rare, but I have found them this year, usually near the edge of the grassland along what we call the ecotone, or where one vegetation type blends into another. Also within the grassland itself, I found a few scattered plants of annual fleabane, Erigeron annuus, a North American species that was introduced to Europe in the 17th century as an ornamental plant. There are also some plants of Chinese mugwort, Artemisia verlotiorum, which spread across Europe during the early 20th century as fragments of plant material in soil surrounding the roots of imported trees and shrubs. But not all alien species are invasive, and indeed there's a range from casual aliens, which need a continuous input of seeds or material to sustain the population and can't persist spontaneously, through naturalized species or aliens with self-sustaining populations but which do not spread, to invasive species which spread aggressively over long distances. Just to be clear, all of the alien species found here are usually considered to be invasive species or aggressive agricultural weeds. But the fact that I only found a few individuals of these species shows that something must be stopping them from taking over. We've already seen that the plant community is composed of a few dominant stress tolerator species, and the subordinate and transient species tend to have a range of ecological strategies and opportunistically occupy the microscale niches between the clumps of the dominant plants. The alien species are essentially transient species, represented by one or two individuals that are not suitably adapted to be dominant, and which are, in a sense, attempting to survive in a place that is already occupied by more appropriately adapted species. They don't immediately achieve dominance because they're too late to the party, a phenomenon known as biotic resistance. So biotic resistance is essentially a low invasibility on the part of the plant community, and invasion as a process doesn't just depend on the characteristics of the alien species, but also on the state of the existing plant community. And plant communities with high species richness are not easily invaded. This is crucial to understand because on the one hand I might say that invasive species are not a problem for this resilient species-rich community, but on the other hand I know that this dry grassland depends on management by the landowner, a guy called Massimo, and if he changes the way the land is used, or abandons or sells the land, then the alien species are sitting there waiting for things to change as nuclei of future colonization. So the real danger is that alien species can become invasive if they're present and the environmental conditions change in a way that favors them. And we can see this in patches of grassland owned by other people that in this particular year haven't mown or managed the land. Just above Massimo's plot is an olive grove where the grassland hasn't been mown and the plants are much larger. Some of these are native species, increasing the local native biodiversity, also of dependent animal species. For example, we've been seeing plenty of flower and pollen-eating beetles in this grassland, most of which are relatively small. I found rose chafers, a native species that is larger than the other beetles and needs larger quantities of pollen and flowers to sustain it. And it seems to be associated with these larger native plants. But alongside the native species, I also found a number of invasive aliens, and notably the lack of management, evidently for more than one season, has led to invasion by one of the most notorious invasive tree species, Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima. This is a clear demonstration of the importance of management, but it also reflects the ecological process of succession, in the sense that management resets the succession and doesn't allow these larger woody species to survive. And the presence of Tree of Heaven essentially represents a kind of perverted succession, diverted away from the natural progression towards, in this particular case, oak hornbeam woodland, towards something resembling a subtropical Asian forest. Incidentally, I also found a single plant of Chinese fan palm, Trachycarpus fortuni, and several plants of black locust, Robinia pseudoacacia, which are also aggressively invasive species, but these are currently under control here. Black locust also has its fans because its copious flowers and nectar production can support quality honey production, and there are beehives here that will actually benefit from this, and the wood is actually useful, although ecologically its spread across Europe from Paris in the 17th century has been a disaster for broadleaf woodlands. Until now, we've been considering the direct effects of alien plant invasion on local plant diversity, but not all invasive species are plants, and not all have direct effects on plant diversity. In part 3, I talked about the patchiness and heterogeneity and the small-scale agricultural use of this land, and I briefly showed that one of the crops here is grapevine. This year, fruit crops in northern Italy have suffered the massive invasion of the so-called Japanese scarab beetle, Popillia japonica. Milan is served by 3 international airports, and the first reported sighting of this beetle in Europe was near Milan in 2014. Incidentally, it has been invasive in North America since the early 20th century, but has only just made it to Milan and so to Europe. Over the last year, populations of this species have exploded in northern Italy, illustrating the effect of predator release, or when an alien species finds itself in a new geographic range when none of its natural predators are present and it's free to multiply. Personally, I've seen Popillia on fruit trees in orchards where people usually notice it, but also in grasslands around Milan, where it damages shrubs such as alder buckthorn, Frangula alnus, and hazel, Corylus avellana, but, and this is the most worrying observation, decimating the topmost leaves of native trees, such as the black poplar. This is the detail from the top of one tree that I found, but looking across the landscape I can imagine millions of trees supporting millions of beetles. If this is a problem that affects trees and shrubs, why is this important to our grassland biodiversity? Well, don't forget that the grassland exists in part due to the economic activities that the owner decides to do there. So coming back to Massimo's grapevine plants, he told me that a few weeks ago each single plant was covered in thousands of beetles. And looking at them today, I also found that many beetles were still present. Massimo cultivates his crops organically, so he didn't want to spray huge amounts of pesticides on the plants, and tried his best with materials that he had to hand, such as copper sulfate and anti-hail netting. But these were ineffective against the small and resistant beetle. This is important to the local plant diversity because that depends on Massimo and what he decides to do with the land. If he decides that the current crops will not produce and changes the land use, or sells it or abandons it, then the invasive beetle effectively threatens the existence of the grassland. In practice, this ecosystem has survived invasions by invasive insects in the past. Thankfully, the predator release effect doesn't last forever, as local predators and disease organisms learn to exploit the invasive species and start to reduce their population sizes. So this wave of Popillia is likely to be an extreme event that eventually leads to a new normal, in which it exists as just another background problem that occasionally builds up to an acute threat. Coming back to the plant diversity found in the grassland, the message is that invasive species can have direct and indirect effects that are mediated by the economic activity and management decisions. In a sense, this is good news for protected areas such as natural parks, because a few individuals can make management decisions that favour native biodiversity.